Do you know how widely the US government is using AI today?
I do not. I do not.
Would you like to?
I would. Do you have a list?
I got a
Get
list.
a
And
list.
actually, there is literally a list and it's available on GitHub. You can go and look it up for yourself so you can fact check this. But in early 2024, the White House Office of Management and Budget published a federal AI use case inventory. It includes 2,133 distinct use cases from 40 agencies. Some are still in develop, some are actively in use, and about 15% of them are flagged as potentially rights or safety impacting. And again, the list is available on GitHub so you can actually see the list. So, notably, the security and defense departments are not required to report. So, you can imagine that there's a lot of additional use cases where it might be being deployed, but are not required to report for safety reasons. But the largest departments in terms of using safety impacting AI systems are the DOJ and the Veterans Affairs Department. So, that was interesting to see as well.
I want to hear about maybe a couple examples and just point out to listeners, like if you're interested in ways you could potentially use AI, there's 2,000 examples of how the government is using AI today. It was fascinating to read through this list. It's a huge list. Of course, I use ChatGPT to navigate it for me. But Annie, you mentioned the words rights impacting and safety impacting. Like, what does that mean, and what's the implication of a rights or safety impacting designation for these models?
Well, I think that that's a fantastic question. And I think this is one of the questions that sort of plagues the regulatory debates around AI, which is how do you distinguish when something is safety impacting versus not? And is it strictly have to be impacting in one direction? And all of us might have different points of view about that. So for instance, like maybe you have a AI use case that is going to provide meaningful real-time data to a human analyst that's going to make decisions about it, and it's a high risk area, right? We used the example earlier of like drones, right? So a drone that's gathering intel to give to an analyst that's going to make a high stakes decision. Is that safety impacting if it's just making the human decision maker faster and better? Or is it only safety impacting if you sort of fully allow the decision to be made in an autonomous way by the AI? That's not a very clear line to draw there. And of course, the more that something is safety impacting, the higher guardrails there are around the system. And so you get into this really interesting debate around if you have tooling that is going to be safety impacting in the positive direction, you don't want to over regulate it in a way that makes it harder to actually get out there in the real world for use. So there's some fascinating questions, and I'm very curious how the government has answered them for themselves because we've seen a little preview of how governments are answering them in proposed legislation. And it's not always clear to me whether those same standards are being applied here or maybe they have a different benchmark that they've come up with.
I actually got to talk to someone who was involved in this process of designating some of these models, defining describing the use case. And of course, the description of what the models are being used for quality can vary widely in those descriptions in this database. But really interesting to see that they did come up with a list of criteria, a set of questions they asked to determine if this was the primary decision criteria or one of many inputs. If it was an automated decision, that of course really changed the level of oversight. But really, I thought whether the answers are right or wrong, I thought the process they went through of saying, here's the kinds of things that would make a model higher concern of the type of use and would increase the level of oversight, scrutiny, governance that we have. And here's the criteria. And of course, you'll change those criteria and figure it out better over time. But I thought that process was a good example of how I know Upstart has done this, defining the models you're using, defining what kind of use cases and the level of oversight required for those use cases, and having some categories so you're not making everything up. Oh, what's the right level of governance for this model? And say, well, it's a category A, B, or C. And here's like non-impacting, rights impacting, safety impacting. Okay. And each of those has a set of criteria for how you govern them and a set of criteria for how you determine what they are. That's a pretty good mechanism overall for most companies, I think, to start thinking about how they're overseeing their AI inventory of models.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you asked earlier for some examples of some of the ways that they're using it. I have a maybe a spicy example. One of the more controversial ones was that they're deploying a tool called Babel, and it's used by the Custom and Border Protection Agency. And basically what it'll do is it'll scan the internet but also the dark web for a lot of information on a specific person that they're looking for, and it'll scan things like their social media posts, news stories, web activity, their geolocation, the language that they're using, all of these types of things, and they'll use it to sort of connect the dots and make a picture or a story around whoever this person is. And it's one of those things that becomes controversial because there's a lot of cases that do come up where you would really want them to be able to triangulate who somebody is and get a full picture really fast to prevent,
Mhm.
terrorism and this type of thing. But if overused, there's also a kind of a creepy feeling of government surveillance on private citizens, and so that is a tricky line to walk.
It's a fascinating use case, this system. I was reading about this, and I think it's such a great example because it shows both the kinds of controls you can place on when does such a system get triggered. It's obviously clearly not being used on every name they have, but like what is the protocol, the tracking, the governance and oversight of when someone can and can't use this system to dig into someone, but also on the back end, what kinds of decisions might be influenced or made automatically, or how does this feed into an actual follow-on process? Are we going to deny entry to someone? Are we going to go looking for someone who's in the country or someone who's out of the country? And so whenever we say it depends in terms of is this a good use or a bad use? Is this model appropriate or inappropriate? It does depend because you get these really interesting questions of like, when is the model being used? What's the oversight of that? And then what is the output of the model being used to determine in terms of follow on actions? This is a great example of how you can have, very problematic uses is being triggered on everybody, and there's just automated decisions about deportations being taken. That would be very troubling. It's triggered in specific concerns of terrorism, and it's used as one of 50 inputs to, investigators. And like, that would be a very seemingly reasonable use of a technology. And so it's a great example, I think, of how you can provide governance and how the right answer can really depend on what that front and back end looks like in terms of when and where the model's being used and how its predictions are being leveraged.
That's right. And I think like one of the important things to note here, which is probably an uncomfortable truth, is that because this is all public data, it's all data they already have access to. Their ability to scan it and make use of it just got better, right? And so that's the thing that I think, people have to keep in mind is these models aren't always bringing on new risks that just didn't exist before. It's just that they're amplifying the sort of speed at which, bad things can happen if misused.